You're lying awake at 2:17 in the morning. The house is quiet. The lights are off. But your mind is doing what it always does when the world finally stops making noise. It starts calculating. How much is left in the retirement account? How many years will it last? What happens if the market crashes? What happens if the roof needs replacing? What happens if you live longer than you expected? You pick up your phone. You check your bank account. Then you check it again. And for a moment, you feel okay. Until you remember the car sitting outside, the expensive kitchen renovation, the subscription you barely use, the financial advisor charging fees you don't fully understand, the new television you bought because the old one was starting to look dated, and suddenly, the number in your retirement account doesn't feel like money anymore. It feels like time. Every dollar is a tiny piece of your future, and you begin to wonder, what if the real danger to your retirement isn't one catastrophic financial mistake? What if it's something much quieter? Something that happens every month, every year. 1,000 small decisions that feel harmless individually, but slowly turn your financial security into a leaking bucket. Because here's the strange part. Some retirees with substantial wealth don't necessarily live the way you might expect. They don't always drive the newest cars. They aren't constantly remodeling their homes. They don't chase every luxury trend. And they don't spend money simply because they can. They have discovered something most people never learn. The secret to keeping wealth isn't just knowing how to make money. It's knowing how to become emotionally immune to spending it. And once you understand why that happens, you'll start seeing retirement spending completely differently. Because the first thing almost nobody realizes is this. The wealthiest retirees aren't necessarily the people who spend the least. They're the people who spend with the least emotional friction. They don't have to constantly fight themselves. They've built a financial life where the expensive choice often feels less attractive than the sensible one. And that distinction changes everything. Consider someone named David. David is 67 years old. For most of his working life, he was an electrical engineer. He earned a good income, but nothing extraordinary. He wasn't a celebrity. He didn't build a technology company. He never received a massive inheritance. By the time he retired, he had accumulated enough investments to live comfortably. His wife, Linda, had worked as a school administrator. Together, they had something many people approaching retirement desperately want. Options. They could travel occasionally. They could help their children. They could handle an unexpected expense without immediately panicking. But David had one rule. He didn't want to become the kind of person who slowly spent his way backward, because he had watched it happen to people around him. A friend retired with nearly $1 million. 5 years later, the friend was worried. Not because the investments had disappeared, because the lifestyle had expanded. First came the luxury SUV, then the expensive home renovation, then the golf club membership, then the financial advisor, then the little things. And that's where David noticed something. The problem wasn't any single purchase. It was the psychological system behind them. Every purchase had a reason. The car was safer. The renovation was an investment. The golf membership was for socializing. The advisor was worth the fee because you can't put a price on peace of mind. Individually, every decision sounded reasonable. Together, they created a machine that continuously converted wealth into lifestyle. And once that machine starts running, it becomes incredibly difficult to turn off. Behavioral economists have a name for part of what happens here. It's called lifestyle inflation. But the deeper psychological force underneath it is something more powerful. Identity. Because once you start seeing yourself as someone who drives a certain car, lives in a certain neighborhood, wears a certain brand, or renovates your home every few years, spending stops feeling like spending. It starts feeling like maintaining who you are. And that's when wealth becomes vulnerable. Because you're no longer asking, do I need this? You're asking, what does it say about me if I don't have it? That's a completely different question. And wealthy retirees who preserve their fortunes often learn to separate the two. David did something surprisingly simple. He bought a 3-year-old car. Not an old car. Not a cheap car. A good car. Reliable. Safe. Comfortable. Just not brand new. The salesman had shown him a newer model first. It was beautiful. The interior smelled like new leather. The dashboard looked like a spaceship. The monthly payment was manageable. That's the dangerous word. Manageable. Because almost anything can become manageable when you divide the price into monthly payments. But David had learned to look at purchases differently. He didn't ask how much the payment was. He asked what the purchase would be worth after 5 years. That's a subtle psychological shift. The first question focuses your brain on affordability. The second focuses it on value. And value is where wealthy spending habits begin. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has consistently shown that transportation is one of the largest categories in household spending. But here's what makes cars especially dangerous. A car doesn't just cost you the purchase price. It depreciates. You pay for insurance, maintenance, fuel, taxes, registration, and then there's the opportunity cost. The money sitting in a depreciating asset can't be doing something else. David understood that. He didn't hate cars. He simply refused to confuse a car with wealth. That distinction saved him more money than any clever investment strategy ever could. And this brings us to the second discovery. The wealth-preserving retiree doesn't just avoid expensive things. They avoid paying for things that don't meaningfully improve their lives. That's a much more powerful rule. Think about extended warranties. You've probably been offered one. At the electronics store. At the dealership. When buying an appliance. The pitch usually sounds familiar. For just a little more. And your brain immediately imagines the disaster. What if it breaks? What if something goes wrong? What if I regret not buying the protection? This is loss aversion. The psychological tendency to feel the pain of a potential loss more strongly than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. The salesperson isn't really selling you a warranty. They're selling you relief from anxiety. And sometimes, that relief is worth paying for. But sometimes, you're paying to insure something you could easily replace. David learned to pause. He stopped asking, "What if this breaks?" He started asking, "What is the expected cost of this risk?" That question created distance between emotion and decision. And that distance is incredibly valuable. Because retirement is a long game. You don't usually lose your financial security in one dramatic moment. You lose it through friction. A fee here, a warranty there, a slightly more expensive car, a home renovation because the kitchen feels outdated, a subscription you forgot about, a financial product with a fee you barely notice. One drop doesn't empty a bucket, but a bucket with 100 tiny holes eventually becomes empty. And the most dangerous holes are often the ones you stop seeing. This is why wealthy retirees often develop another unusual habit. They stop chasing trends. Not because they don't appreciate beautiful things, but because they understand how quickly outdated is manufactured. One year, the kitchen is modern. Then the countertops are wrong. The cabinets are wrong. The fixtures are wrong. Suddenly, your perfectly functional home feels embarrassing. That's not an accident. Entire industries depend on convincing you that what you already own is no longer good enough. And social comparison makes the effect even stronger. You see someone's renovated kitchen online. Then your own kitchen suddenly looks old. You see someone's luxury vacation. Then your last vacation feels inadequate. You see someone's new car. And suddenly, your reliable 10-year-old vehicle feels like a personal failure. The comparison never ends because the reference point keeps moving. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a shifting baseline. You don't compare yourself to where you were. You compare yourself to the newest thing you've just seen. And that creates a treadmill. You keep running, but you never arrive. David and Linda decided to step off that treadmill. When their kitchen needed work, they didn't gut the entire room. They replaced what was broken. They improved what genuinely bothered them. They fixed the lighting. They repaired the cabinets. They chose durable materials. The result wasn't spectacular on Instagram. It was simply better. And that's an important distinction. They weren't optimizing for admiration. They were optimizing for usefulness. The wealthy retiree often asks a question that sounds almost boring. Will this still matter to me 5 years from now? If the answer is yes, they consider it. If the answer is no, they hesitate. Because they understand something about dopamine. New things feel good, but the feeling fades. Behavioral research on hedonic adaptation shows that people often return toward their previous level of satisfaction after positive changes. The new car becomes normal. The renovated kitchen becomes normal. The expensive watch becomes normal. And then your brain wants the next thing. That's the trap. You don't buy happiness. You rent excitement, and the rent keeps increasing. This is where David's financial life began to change. He and Linda started spending more on experiences they actually valued. They took a road trip. They invited friends over for dinner. They joined a walking group. David picked up an old hobby he'd abandoned decades earlier: woodworking. The tools weren't cheap, but compared with the cost of golf memberships, luxury travel, and constant entertainment, it was surprisingly affordable. And something unexpected happened. He became happier, not because he had found a secret investment, because he had stopped outsourcing his happiness to consumption. This is the part that matters more than almost anything else in retirement. Your spending habits are often a reflection of your emotional habits. If you're lonely, you might spend. If you're bored, you might spend. If you're anxious, you might spend. If you're trying to prove that you're doing okay, you might spend. Retail therapy works for a reason. Buying something creates a temporary sense of control. You feel bad. You buy something. For a moment, you feel better. The problem is that the emotional problem is still there. And now you have less money. So the cycle begins again. The purchase becomes the painkiller, but the pain returns. And eventually, the painkiller becomes expensive. David didn't eliminate spending. He eliminated automatic spending. Instead of asking, "What should I buy?" he started asking, "What am I feeling right now?" That question sounds almost too simple, but it changes the entire decision. Because sometimes you don't need a new jacket. You need to call a friend. Sometimes you don't need a vacation. You need rest. Sometimes you don't need a new television. You need something to look forward to. And sometimes, you just need to sit with the feeling long enough for it to pass. That is emotional spending immunity. And it may be one of the most valuable forms of financial security a retiree can develop. But there's another leak. And this one is especially difficult to notice because it often arrives disguised as professionalism. Financial advice. David had used a financial advisor for years. The advisor wasn't dishonest. He wasn't incompetent. But David eventually realized something. He didn't fully understand what he was paying. There were management fees, fund expenses, account fees, and other costs that seemed small. Each one looked harmless. But small percentages become meaningful over long periods. This is why low-cost investing has become such a major theme in personal finance research. The difference between a low-cost investment approach and a higher-cost one may look insignificant in a single year. But over decades, fees compound too. And here's the uncomfortable part. People understand that investment returns compound. They often forget that costs compound as well. Imagine two snowballs rolling downhill. One grows. The other grows too. But one is constantly losing tiny pieces of snow. You may not notice the difference at the beginning, but after years of rolling, the gap becomes enormous. David didn't decide that every financial advisor was bad. That's not the lesson. The lesson was simpler. Understand what you're paying. Understand what you're getting. And don't assume that expensive automatically means better. The same principle applied to his hobbies. David didn't need 5 expensive hobbies. He needed 2 or 3 things that made his life feel full. Walking, woodworking, cooking with Linda, helping his grandchildren. None of these required him to constantly increase his spending to maintain the experience. And this created something more valuable than a low budget. It created a low-cost life he actually enjoyed. That's the difference. A person who hates their inexpensive life will eventually escape it. A person who genuinely enjoys their life doesn't need to constantly upgrade it. And slowly, David's financial system began to resemble something else. An engine. His investments were the engine. His spending was the fuel. His habits were the steering wheel. And his emotions? They were the weather. He couldn't control the weather, but he could stop letting every storm change the direction of the car. 3 years passed. Then 5. David and Linda didn't become dramatically richer. Something more important happened. They became harder to financially destabilize. When the roof needed repairs, they didn't panic. When the market fell, they didn't immediately sell everything. When their friends bought newer cars, they didn't feel deprived. They had built something that money alone cannot buy. Margin, room, space between what happened and how they responded. And that's what true retirement wealth often looks like. Not luxury, not extravagance, not an impressive photograph. It's the ability to absorb life without being forced into bad decisions. But there's one final idea that brings all of this together. The wealthiest retirees aren't simply good at saying no. They're good at knowing what deserves a yes. They spend generously on things that genuinely matter: health, time, family, comfort, safety, experiences. The difference is that their spending has a purpose. They aren't buying things to impress people who aren't thinking about them. They're buying things that make their own lives better. That's the psychological shift. You stop asking, "Can I afford this?" And you start asking, "Does this deserve a place in my life?" Those questions sound similar. They're not. The first question is about money. The second is about meaning. And after retirement, meaning becomes more important than most people realize. Because you have limited years left, limited attention, limited energy, and every dollar you spend is connected to something else you could have done with it. That's opportunity cost. Money spent on something forgettable can't be spent on something meaningful. So the goal isn't to die with the biggest number in your bank account. The goal is to make sure your money supports the life you actually want. Now imagine David at 74. He's sitting on the back porch. The car outside is several years old. The kitchen isn't the newest in the neighborhood. His clothes don't carry giant logos. He still enjoys nice things, but he no longer needs them to tell a story about him. His retirement account has survived market crashes. His home has survived trends. And perhaps most importantly, his happiness has survived shopping. That's the real achievement. Because the greatest threat to wealth isn't always poverty. Sometimes it's the inability to feel satisfied. If you constantly need something new to feel okay, there will never be enough money. But if you can build a life that feels good without constantly upgrading it, you have already solved one of the hardest financial problems there is. You have made your lifestyle smaller than your ego, and your future larger than your impulses. So tonight, or tomorrow morning, look around your life. Look at the car, the house, the subscriptions, the hobbies, the financial advice you're paying for, the things you bought because you wanted them, and the things you bought because you wanted to feel something. Then ask yourself one question. Not, "Can I afford this?" Ask, "Is this actually making my life better?" Because that question might be the beginning of something bigger than saving money. It might be the beginning of becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to spend money to feel secure. And when you reach that point, you don't just protect your wealth. You become free from the need to prove that you have it. If this changed how you think about even one purchase, like this video so YouTube can put it in front of others who are serious about retirement, and subscribe to Weston Wealth for weekly breakdowns of the quiet psychology behind money most people never talk about. And tell me in the comments, what's the one purchase you're rethinking tonight?